This week on Jerusalem Dateline, a look ahead at the coming year. Does the terror attack in Paris foretell an increase in terrorism in 2015? What about the Middle East? Does war loom ahead? Will the U.S.-Israel relationship be tested this year? And what about Christians throughout the Middle East suffering through some of the worst persecution in centuries? Our CBN News team takes a look and looks ahead. This week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this special edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. This week we take a look at what we can expect in the year 2015. I'm joined here in our Jerusalem Bureau by CBN News' Julie Stahl and in our CBN headquarters by John Waggy and Dale Hurd. We're just a few days into 2015 and already Muslim extremists have carried out a vicious terror attack in France. They attacked a newspaper known for making fun of radical Islam and even publishing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. Dale, you've been to Paris many times and chronicled the rise of radical Islam there. What can you tell us about who this group might be and why they targeted this newspaper?
Well, they told the person that let them into the building, an employee, they were Al-Qaeda. And Charlie Hebdo is one of these far-left magazines featuring cartoons, some of which are frankly profane. And so they've enraged Muslims with the way they've made fun of the Prophet Muhammad.
And what can you tell us about the growth and strength of radical Islam in Europe, particularly in Paris? I know you've done some amazing stories there, Dale, about some actually no-go zones, parts of Paris where police don't go, where basically Muslims control those parts of Paris.
Right, and we have to make the point that you're going to see the idea that these guys were with ISIS and they came back, and that may be true, and they've said they were Al-Qaeda. But you know, you wouldn't need for Al-Qaeda or ISIS to exist for this to happen because of the sort of toxic environment in France, which both minimizes the threat of radical Islam and keeps these people in a ghetto by themselves called no-go zones. Police don't go there. They're in control of some of these areas, and that's where they planned this attack.
Do you think part of this is the fruit of political correctness? And why do you think the French government hasn't been stronger in confronting radical Islam?
Because the label Islamophobe in France can end your career if you're a politician or a journalist. Remember that during the Christmas season, 2 vans in France plowed into people, at least one driven by a Muslim, and we had a knife attack on French police officers by a Muslim. And the French government never said that these were related to Islam. This whole minimalization of the problem made this outcome a mathematical certainty. We knew this was going to happen someday.
Yeah, and Dale, in a larger sense, do you think this is an attack on free speech, not only in France, but the rest of the Western world?
To me, it's a statement that Muslims believe they're going to win. There are only 6 million Muslims in France. I mean, that's a lot. They had the boldness to do this. And I'll say something else. We've done stories in which the French have warned that France would become Lebanon someday because of the way they've coddled terrorists. And what happened in Paris is something that would have happened in Beirut. A news office was raided, journalists were killed, and you have a small army operating inside France.
Yeah, Julie, talking about Islam, 2014 ended and 2015 began with an attempt by the Palestinian Authority to have themselves declared a state by the United Nations Security Council. That vote failed, and now they're trying to get into the International Criminal Court. And we have a soundbite by Yair Lapid, the former finance minister here in Israel, about that thing.
Israel will not allow the Palestinians to drag our soldiers to the ICC. The Israeli army, the IDF, is the most moral army in the world. We have examined ourselves more thoroughly than any other army has ever did in the history of wars, and this is just pure and low propaganda, and we will not tolerate with this.
Julie, how do you think the Netanyahu government is responding to what the Palestinian Authority is doing right now?
Well, we heard what Yair Lapid said. He's basically saying the same thing that Benjamin Netanyahu is saying, that Israel, these soldiers that would be brought before the criminal court, that they have fought for Israel. They have laid their lives down for Israel, and so Israel will fight for them. Israel is not part of the International Criminal Court, but if those soldiers, for instance, traveled to Europe, traveled to South Africa, they could be arrested in those countries and tried. But Israel's not going to let that happen if it's possible. Israel is probably also going to play hardball and throw it back in the Palestinians' court. If they actually do bring charges against Israel, Israel will definitely bring charges against them for attacking civilians.
One other big thing that's been happening last year and probably this year as well is the confrontation over the Temple Mount. Do you expect that to be a big issue in the coming year?
I do believe it will be. I think that's going to be an issue until the Lord returns. The Temple Mount is, as we know, it's a holy place to the Muslims, but it's also the place where the Jewish temple sat. It's definitely, the more and more Jewish people want to go up there and pray. They're not afraid of a ruckus, and so I think it's definitely going to continue this year.
Yeah, John, one major issue that's been happening, and in this week, a new Congress was sworn in, and now the Republicans control not only the House, but they control the Senate as well. What impact do you think that's going to have on diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Israel?
Well, I think that there's a very good chance that there's going to be much tighter scrutiny of those relations and probably a spotlight being shown on the kinds of things that the Obama administration has tried to accomplish behind closed doors. Rand Paul, just this week, the new Congress was barely in its seats, and Rand Paul has proposed a cutoff of funding to the Palestinian Authority for their willingness to take Israel to the International Criminal Court. Now, this is the kind of thing that you can see in hearings in both the House and Senate, and I think that President Obama, John Kerry, and the major foreign policy actors in the Obama administration are going to have to answer for more, if for no other reason than the 2016 presidential election's already begun, and there are a lot of not only Republican candidates, but Democrats who want to distance themselves from some of the Obama policies that are going to say, wait a minute, what are we doing here? What is the United States doing? Are they making things better in the Middle East or worse? And I think that you're going to see a lot of questioning of what the Obama administration's been doing.
Yeah, John, do you also think that this new Congress is going to have an impact on the nuclear negotiations with Iran?
Well, I think it will. I think that they've indicated in the past year, even before Republicans took the Senate, that both Republicans and Democrats were very concerned about a bad deal with Iran. And I think that they will hold hearings to profile what the administration's been doing and try to hold their feet to the fire. Now, President Obama's going for a legacy, so at the same time, he's calling for Iran to take its rightful place in the community of nations. So I'm not sure he's going to pay that much attention to Congress. He certainly hasn't so far. And now that Republicans control it, I don't know that he'll do any more than that. But we do have the 2016 election as a backdrop for all of this foreign policy debate.
Yeah, we'll see how that happens this coming year. One other thing, John, that's we're anticipating over here in Israel is a new elections coming up in March. Even though we're a few months away from that, how would you sort of define the political landscape over here in Israel?
Well, I think that the Israeli elections are going to pretty much commandeer the attention in the Middle East unless we see some sort of war or concerted attack. I think that Benjamin Netanyahu dissolved the Knesset so he could try to get a more agreeable coalition for what he thinks, I believe, is a preparation for possible war, and he wants to have some stability and cut down on the sniping. Now, the left is arguing Netanyahu is not being tough on groups like Hamas, and at the same time, they're saying he poisoned the atmosphere with the United States and Europe, and so they will be the ones that can get along. Well, you can't stand up to Hamas and get along with the West and with Washington. And so the left is going to have some trouble with that. We'll see how it plays out in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, that'll be one of the major things that we'll be looking forward to this year. Well, Dale, John, and Julie, thank you very much. And coming up, we'll talk more about the rise of Islamic terrorism throughout the Middle East and around the world. Welcome back. The terror attack in Paris raises concerns about increasing anti-Semitism throughout Europe and the Middle East. Gary Lane, Julie Stahl, and Dale Hurd are here for more on this topic. Dale, anti-Semitism is on the rise in Europe, and you've covered that topic extensively throughout the years. How bad is the situation for Jews in Europe right now?
They tell me it's as bad as it's been since the 1930s. Virtually every synagogue that I've visited in Europe has security around it, police, and often these synagogues have their own security details, synagogue members that have formed their own private security force to police the neighborhood. Jews in Europe tell me that they expect more Jews to die. They expect more Jews to be murdered. It's just a matter of where and when it will happen.
Gary, the Holocaust, the mass extermination of Jews in Europe, it's just barely 70 years ago. How can European governments be so complacent about anti-Semitism?
Well, they're complacent about a lot of things, Chris. Actually, complacent about the rise of radical Islam. They don't see radical Islam as a threat. And I think as you're seeing more anti-Semitism, more attacks in Europe, you're going to see more people in Europe, more Europeans standing up against this and putting pressure on their governments to respond.
Yeah, and Gary, it's not just Europe, but it's also what's happening with anti-Semitism in the Middle East.
Well, anti-Semitism has been there for centuries in the Middle East, but it isn't just anti-Semitism, it's anti-Christianity. There are many Muslims that are very much against the Christians. As we know, ISIS, talking to Christians there in Iraq, and also some that have fled violence in Syria. They are saying, and they have told me, that they really face extinction now. I had Christians telling me they expect maybe no more than about 150,000 Christians will remain in that country because of the rise of ISIS.
Right. And I know we'll talk more about that in the next segment, Gary. You know, Julie, one thing that's happened here in Israel is the record number of Jews immigrating from Europe here to Israel. What's happening?
Well, that's very interesting what Dale said, that the Jews are saying it's the worst anti-Semitism since the 1930s. The difference between now and then is they have someplace to come. They can come to Israel. So, and many of them are. Last year, there was the highest amount of French Jews ever. It was the highest amount of French Jews were the highest amount of Jews to enter Israel, and there were more than 7,000. But Natan Sharansky said 50,000 Jews, French Jews, asked for information on immigrating last year. That's amazing. And just this week, the head of one of the anti-Semitic watchdog organizations announced that he is going to immigrate to Israel, and he said it's a message. And the message is it's better to leave than to have to run away. So I think that's the trend we're going to see, especially of the French Jews.
And we just did a story back in December about not only French Jews, but Jews from Ukraine. So this seems to be an increasing trend throughout Europe and different places. Dale, back to you. I asked Gary this question. Why do you think some of these European governments don't recognize anti-Semitism, don't defend against it, and sort of don't address this issue of radical Islam?
Well, they play a double game. I mean, when Jews are killed, the head of state will go out and lay a wreath. But the big culprit in Europe is the media and the vilification of Israel. And anti-Israel has sort of morphed into anti-Semitism. And so the big blame lies with the media.
Mm-hmm. And what do you see for the next coming year? Do you see the rise of more anti-Semitism and the rise of radical Islam there in Europe?
I think it's only going to get worse, although the event that started today, you could call it in a sense France's 9/11, not in numbers of dead, but this is a wake-up call for France. And France is a leader in Europe, and perhaps we will see a change now in the way radical Muslims are treated.
Mm-hmm. And Julie, finally back to you. The year ahead, do you see more Jews emigrating from Europe and around the world?
I do believe they will. They'll be coming. I think that's what Israel believes too, that they're preparing for immigrants. They always have immigrants here. They have a very good system of absorbing immigrants, teaching them the language, teaching them Hebrew. So they'll be prepared.
Yeah, and I know one thing we addressed in our story, this is a prophetic fulfillment.
It is definitely a prophetic fulfillment.
Yeah.
And, the Lord is going to fulfill His word. And He says He's going to bring the Jewish people back from all over the world to Israel.
Yeah, and it's happening.
It is happening.
Well, Julie, Gary, Dale, thank you. Well, up next, the rise of ISIS and the spread of Christian persecution, some say was the worst in centuries.